And we are live just at the sigh. I hate Hangouts, I really do. It takes forever to get started, it takes forever to stop. But the stuff in the middle is interesting. Today, I'm here together with the dog of Sinoop, and we're going to talk about psychiatry. This is something that we addressed during a Hangout, 2 weeks ago now, I think?
I think, yeah.
To me, it was very interesting, so I basically said, let's do a Hangout on this. And he said, okay. So there you have it. Now, this is an impromptu hangout, so that there are no people in the chat at this point in time is to be expected. But to me, the topic is more important. So if this is an interesting topic to you, I would advise you to listen throughout the hangout, because from what I noticed last time, the dog of Sinoop is well versed, and the things he did say back then aren't that strange, but at the same time, it is something that we need to talk about. And sorry, John, I was wrong. For fuck's sake, even an impromptu video, and there you are. Well, you're welcome to stay as long as you want, John. But this is going to be a talk between me and Sinoop, and it is going to be about psychiatry in the broadest terms. We're not going to give diagnoses to anyone or anything like that, but we are going to talk about how things come across. Bloody hell. Hi there, Toxic Threat. Just saying no one will be in the chat, and now I've already got 2 people. I'm sorry, dog. Do you mind me saying dog or Sinoop, by the way?
You can call me Will or whatever you like. I'm impossible to offend.
Ah, okay. Well, I'm going to give the floor to you then, because you had your ideas, and it's better for me to talk about your ideas when they come from you than when I present them. So, take it away.
Well, as I remember the discussion before, I think all I was doing was riffing on the credibility of modern psychology, which is not to suggest that it has more or less than it ever did. But there's a notion, I think, throughout much of our society that it has conducted real authoritative science that stands shoulder to shoulder with the other scientific disciplines, and that the people that are accredited by the various institutions should be taken largely as seriously as, say, an oncologist or a cardiologist or what have you. And whether or not that is appropriate or not, my perception is that is what is occurring. Okay. And let me just complete my thought here, is that because people do generally trust them, when some of these people come out with their goofy ideas or their irresponsible diagnoses, people just kind of listen and believe. And that leads to a lot of problems. And so one of the things I was talking about before, which I remember you agreeing with me on, was that there was an epidemic of an overprescription of psychoactive medication.
And downloaded wrong diagnoses.
Right, and all of it is coming, or a significant amount of it is coming from people with all of the correct accreditations, and so that calls into question the legitimacy of those, and whether or not we should just say, well, he's got the diploma, because if you've got a whole bunch of people with a cardiology degree and they keep causing people to have heart attacks, then maybe you shouldn't take them seriously when it comes to advice on your heart. I mean, the reason I would take a cardiologist seriously is because I have a high expectation that they're going to render good medical advice that is in my interest. And I don't have that same confidence when it comes to psychologists.
And this is because this is something you keep saying: psychologists, and psychiatry are 2 different things. So this is the first thing I need to point out.
Well,
a psychiatrist is a medical doctor.
Sure.
A psychologist is, for all intents and purposes, a philosopher.
Sure.
So this is a huge difference. Now, Do I think that devaluates the value of psychology? No. And there are plenty of psychiatrists who are part of the problem, in my humble opinion. But this is the first thing that I really need to point out. A psychologist and a psychiatrist, not the same. Not nearly the same. So if you hear a psychologist say something, then yeah, okay, take it for what you want, but feel free to ignore it as well, because, as I said, he's a philosopher.
I will use a term which, because see, in my experience, they tend to in my experience, they've rendered equivalent diagnoses. And I have some experience with them. I've had experience with them personally. I have experience with them with friends, and I have experience with them institutionally, and I have experience looking at statistics. So it's the full breadth, and I'm not seeing it. So if I appreciate that there is a distinction,
well, I'll
but for my own purpose,
a bit more. I'll try to clarify it a bit, but I'm not going to deny the fact that this could be, as you see. I mean, you're from America. I am not.
Right.
So that's one of the differences. In the Netherlands, a psychologist is not allowed to give a diagnosis. He can suggest a diagnosis, but he cannot give a diagnosis. A psychologist in the Netherlands is not allowed to prescribe medication at all.
Right.
General practitioners like doctors are allowed to do so.
Sure.
But a psychologist is not a doctor. This is the main difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor.
Sure. Well, okay, so something that makes this perhaps worse still, I think you're trying to, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I think you're trying to suggest that the kind that is allowed to prescribe medication is the kind that is more authoritative. Is this correct?
No, not as such more authoritative, because I know that there are plenty of psychiatrists and medical doctors that are still wrong. So on that, I will not attack you or disagree with you, because I agree with you on that. But I do want to point out that there's a huge difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. Sure. One is medical, and the other is, well, for all intents and purpose,
so
a philosopher.
Right, and then there's an additional thing which I suspect this is less or not a problem at all in Holland, but in the United States, there is a system that gives doctors a percentage of the money that the pharmaceutical company gets when the doctor prescribes medication.
Yeah, I'm not sure how that works in the Netherlands, but I find it difficult to believe that there isn't a kickback system.
Right.
I mean, I would prefer that there wasn't one, but I'm not sure, so I can't comment on that. But that a lot of people are making money out of falsely diagnosing certain things. Yeah, unfortunately, this is true.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's pretty common in the United States is that we'll have 2 or more drugs that are chemically almost identical, but there'll be a wildly different price. So one of them, there could be a difference of as much as 1,000% between one and the other.
Yeah.
And so an allegation that's made, and there is some evidence of it, is that the doctors will assess in their own mind the economic resources of the person they're talking to, and if they think they can afford it, what they'll do is they'll suggest the more expensive one, even though it's chemically identical to the less expensive one.
Well, it's not completely chemical identical, but it's mostly chemical identical.
Yeah, I mean enough that it's kind of a joke.
The chemicals that are the working part of the medication are the same, but a pill is made out of the chemicals that work and filler material to actually make it. Sure. That it's the filler material that's the difference. which
Yeah.
can affect people as well, by the way, but that's a completely different story. No, I know that this is the case as well, and this is why I'm so much against socialized medicine, because socialized medicine drives up the cost. This is a completely different topic, though. So I actually made a video about this.
Well,
I want
it isn't, because it does get to additional motivations for doctors to prescribe medication, though. If they have a financial incentive to prescribe medication, then that opens the door for suspicion that might be a problem. And
I agree.
And obviously, it isn't evidence. It isn't evidence that anyone is being unethical inherently, but it does create an impression that it's possible. And I think doctors have a responsibility, the same way that judges do, to make there's no conflict of interest. So, for example, let's say a judge's son gets in a car accident, and his son would come before his own father in the court. The judge is obligated to recuse himself.
Yeah.
Even if the judge believes, and even if he would actually judge the case completely fairly, right? I mean, he might even judge it more harshly. Who knows? But the thing is that he would show no favoritism. I mean, and I'm not saying he would or he wouldn't, but let's just say notionally that he would. He's still obligated to recuse himself, just to remove the impression.
A friend of mine once gave me a very good description of what and why. If you are in a competition with your neighbor on which grows the best fruit, then you should never tie your shoelaces in his yard.
Right.
Because people could interpret it in the wrong way. So on this again, no contest.
Right. Okay.
So these are things that I agree with you on. Obviously, hashtag not all. That's first off. There is more going on, though, because if we look at psychiatry today, there are certain things in psychiatry that we are being pushed to believe. And psychiatrists find it difficult to... I've noticed this. Find it difficult to give counter arguments, because basically political correctness. It's such a lame excuse, but unfortunately it's true. Within psychiatry in the Western world, we use the DSM very much, the diagnostic tool.
Right.
That's written by companies. And yeah, okay, they have a few psychiatrists helping them out, but it's a political tool to help the government decide what to do and what do we not afford for our citizens. What will we pay for our citizens? And to give an example on how, I'm going to use the word corrupt. How corrupt this tool is, I'm going to use the example of gender dysphoria. This is not something we mentioned earlier, but I'm going to use it now anyway. You do know what gender dysphoria is, right?
I do.
Okay.
I do.
For those people out there who do not know what gender dysphoria is the feeling that you are in the wrong body. It's a very shortcut because there is more to it. But basically, if you're a boy, you want to be a girl. If you're a girl, you want to be a boy. Man, woman, woman, man. It's a dysphoria. And what are they saying in the DSM now? They're actually thinking that pushing the idea of helping people with hormones and reconstructive surgery, which it isn't. They call it reconstructive surgery, but it's not constructive, it's destructive.
Right.
Is a good thing to go with it. Now, why is this a good example of the corruption within the higher-ups, so to speak? If we take gender dysphoria, we find that treating with hormones and reconstructive surgery is considered to be a good thing. So they are going with your dysphoria. You have some strange ideas about your self-image, And instead of helping you deal with that self-image, they are pushing your self-image forward. This is comparable to have a person suffering, for example, from body dysphoria, and there are plenty of ways of body dysphoria, anorexia being one of them, to go along with that dysphoria. So let's take the example of anorexia. You have a woman starving herself because she feels she's too fat, and your treatment is going to give her a diet to even lose more weight.
Right.
Now, there's no one out there who will say this is a good idea. But we are doing it with gender dysphoria. Now, I know it's a very simplistic example, so I'm going to give you another form of body dysphoria. This is a form of body dysphoria often seen with men. They feel that they have a weak body, so they feel they need to train more. They want bigger muscles. Beefcake from South Park. I don't know if you remember that small bit with Eric Cartman, but there are people who actually suffer from body dysphoria. There are men suffering from body dysphoria, feeling that they are too weak, too small. So they feel that they are definitely forced to train more. So they have bigger muscles, etc., etc., etc. Now imagine someone who can barely scratch his own back because of the muscles in his arm. And instead of dealing with the body dysmorphia, we're going to give him a rigorous training schedule to make his muscles bigger. Who in their right mind would think this is a good idea? But if we look at gender dysphoria, we see that our psychiatric healthcare system has been overrun by political correctness. So what happens is that instead of looking at what's best for the patient, we are now looking at what does the society think what is best for the patient, and that's what we're going to push.
Right.
And this is, to me, part of the corruption, part of the problem of the system. Now, we were talking last time, we were talking about whether it's possible to fake certain illnesses and psychiatric illnesses, which up to a point, yeah, sure, everything is possible. But that's not the real issue to me. The real issue to me is how psychiatry in itself, even psychology, but even psychiatry, which to me is a different step, it should be higher than psychology, is actually playing along with this political correctness. We are harming our patients, our children, our siblings, to fulfill a political correct narrative. And this is something that in psychiatry is happening so much that even psychiatrists feel reluctant to countermand this. Now, this is not something from the last few weeks. So if you're telling me that, yeah, but I have experiences of doctors doing this, that, and the other, all I can say is, I know you're right. And it's beyond disgusting, I think, is probably one of the best words I can use. Because this is actually damaging not only the faith in our healthcare professionals, but also our very society. More so than, because when we started talking about it last time, you were like, okay, but what if you could mimic this illness, or you could pretend to have that illness, or people cause you to have such and such illness?
Sure.
Which is in all fairness, this is not nice of me to say. In layman's terms, these are very genuine points. I'm not saying they're not genuine points by saying they're layman. No, I'm saying these are layman terms because you don't know of all the other stuff that's going on. So they are still very good points, and you should address them. And personally, I believe that within psychiatry, we can deal with this in a positive way. What makes it more damaging to me is the political correctness, which is in a way forcing psychiatrists to take what we know to be bullshit serious.
Right. Well, they're hardly the only ones. It's a pervasive element throughout all of our society. So, we've got politically correct economics. We've got politically correct, science that applies to all kinds of different things. So it's psychology is in good company. A lot of
But
other
from
institutions
psychology,
are coming under attack. So
in all fairness, it started with sociology and psychology because
yes.
these are philosophies. Here, you can meander about meanings. To me, what makes it dangerous is that medical doctors are going along with this.
Well, they're attacking open source programming, sir. Are you aware of that? Have you been
No.
watching what's been? Okay, so are you familiar with the Linux operating system?
Yeah. Oh, right. I did know that. Yeah.
So Linus Torvald, I believe his name is. In any case,
Yeah. Torvald.
Torvald. There you go. He's basically been forced to be second banana to
Yeah.
some other people because he says the un-PC things. Mostly,
Yeah.
what he does is he yells at people and tells them that they're worthless if
Yeah.
they contribute code that, in his opinion, is inferior or counterproductive to
Yeah.
the purpose of his project.
Which is
And
kind of funny. I'm going to interrupt you for a second because this is
Sure.
the funniest part. He is an equal opportunity asshole.
Oh yes. No,
But
he's
it's only a problem because of a certain group he's being an asshole to.
Well, yeah. I mean, part of what's happened is they've had increasing corporate adoption of Linux. I mean, the operating system has been extremely successful, and the people who are putting the most heat on him are corporate partners. And so what happens is they get a bunch of snowflakes from the corporate world in there, many of whom are actually not actually doing anything. They're more like community liaisons from Corporation X, and they get their feels hurt, and Linus tells them to kill themselves, and then they get mad. But yeah, all I was getting at is that it's gone everywhere. It's gone everywhere. There's no one it hasn't touched.
Yeah, well, that is true. But in all fairness, that it touched psychology and sociology, to me, is not a huge surprise because, in all fairness, that's where it came from. Well, mostly sociology, obviously, and philosophy, but psychology is a form of, as I said earlier, philosophy to me.
Sure.
No, it really is because I can tell you 10 ways to help you deal with certain systems, but they will always be. I'm going to rephrase this. If I see that you have a certain disease, I can give you medication, and on average, that medication has a certain impact on you.
Yeah.
With psychology, I'm trying to change your way of thinking about yourself, thinking about situations, acting in certain situations. This is a nuance-driven methodology.
Sure.
I believe it works because it's my job. Therefore, I might be, how do you call this, biased. But at the same time, I 100% recognize that this is not a hard science, where psychiatry actually is.
I mean, okay. So, are you familiar with the Stanford prison experiment?
Yeah.
What would you say which field would you say that belongs to?
I would say that belongs to psychology.
Okay. So that's the kind you like?
Or rather, I would say that belongs to anthropology.
Right. Well, so are you aware of the problems, the scientific problems with the Stanford prison experiment? Not the ethical problems, but like the actual empirical problems with it.
I am not quite sure what you're getting at, so I'm going to let you go there because fill me in.
All right.
That I don't know. And listen,
well, all right.
Stop
me if you've heard it. Okay.
I'm not going to because there are other people listening and they might not know.
All right. So for those who don't know, the Stanford prison experiment was an experiment where they had a bunch of students assume the roles of prisoner and prison guard in where they would go into a jail cell that the county lockup let an academic department from Stanford use for their experiment. And they put some of the students arbitrarily in prison cells, and they put certain students arbitrarily in the role of prison guard. The supposed conclusion of the experiment was that by placing people in these roles, it inherently causes people to be cruel to the subordinate party. In that, what they believed they determined was that the students put in the position of authority were mistreating the students that were in the subordinate position. Unfortunately, what has actually been revealed to have occurred, and many people still believe that is because that was what they told everybody. It was printed up in magazines. It was megaphoned in mass media. Many editorials and newspapers were written with that as the conclusion. What actually happened was that a number of Stanford students believed it was a good way to study for some exams that were coming up. And what they believed they would be able to do was to do this experiment, get paid, sit in a cell where, you know, there'd be no distractions. They'd sit there with their books, they'd cram for their exams, and then they'd fill out a little questionnaire, collect their money, and leave. That's what they thought they were signing up for. What occurred when they went into the cells is they were not given their books. And so the students were in a situation where they had an exam coming up. They were not permitted to study for it, and so they had to find a way to get out of the out of the prison cells. And so what they did was they just started screaming and caterwauling and saying that they were going crazy, and you know, they'd say anything to get the goddamn cells to open. And so eventually they pulled it off. They were able to create enough of a controversy that the cells were opened and they were allowed to go back to their dorms and cram for their exams. And I think it's a common. So this is sort of this frames to a certain extent a lot of my impression of this field, because I see a lot of science that's come out of running rats through mazes, you know, literally rats through mazes, where they take a rat, they have a maze, they put them in the maze, and they manipulate things to see if the rat gets the cheese or doesn't get the cheese or something. And often as not, there are problems with the way that they've arranged the experiment, and they draw what they believe are authoritative conclusions, despite the fact that their experiment was flawed in some way. Another example, I forget the name of this, I think Molson. This is the shock experiment, you know, the one where there's one gentleman in one room and another gentleman in another room, and one is to ask the other through a machine a question, and when he answers the wrong question, a shock is administered. The conclusion of that one was supposed to be that people, if given an authority figure that tells them to do something unethical, will do it. And that one also had a number of experimental problems with it that corrupted the findings. But yeah, that element, that the experiment was itself scientifically invalid for those reasons, was not well disclosed, nor investigated, nor corrected when they learned it was wrong.
Yeah, because it's a bias operating system. They're not looking for answers; they're looking for confirmation.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So, for example, with that one, and I can get the name of it if somebody wants it. You should be able to find it on Google just by typing in, you know, experimental psychology shock experiment or something like that. It was in the 60s, but the conclusion that they came out with was that this is what they told people, and this was a lie, was that the majority of people carried the experiment all the way to the end and administered a lethal shock to, or at least believed that they had administered a lethal shock, or flipped a switch that would have administered a lethal shock to the other participant. Now, the other participant, it was sort of like a magic act. The other participant actually was not another student. It was a willing participant in the experiment who was like the guy who went into the other room every single time.
Yeah, he was an actor, and he played getting shocked.
Yeah, exactly. And but what is not disclosed is, okay, so he experimented on 700 people. of the 700 people that he experimented on, and he suggested we experimented on 700 people, and the majority of these people did carried it through to the lethal end. That was a misstatement, because yes, they did experiment on 700 people, but only in one of the notional versions of the experiment did the majority carry it forward that much, and it was only for 40 people. So the experiment that was supposedly that authoritative, it was for 40 people. And
double thing in this, and I'm going to interrupt you again. I'm sorry. You're correct. They push certain narratives and they make it stick. Unfortunately, and this is the double thing on this experiment, is you don't know what will happen if more people are allowed by doing this. That's something that in sociology we have recognized many a time before. People agree on reality if the majority of people agree on reality. So imagine the shock of it, that in a period of time when our society is very much against this sort of behavior, still a part of our society is willing to go this far. Now imagine a society where going this far is the norm. Would it still be such a small percentage? The answer to that obviously is we don't know, because we haven't done it. But
well, okay, so let's go into something. Let's make this real. We can see that there are an enormous number of people who try to stand up and speak out against certain things that are happening in our society that they disagree with. And they are not shut down by confirmation bias. What happens is they have to be intimidated. And and that's sort of, so you see this, so the big social networks are popping around telling people who's allowed to speak, what opinions are okay, what opinions are not okay.
And they're trying to silence dissenting voices.
Right, and we see it in academia as well. So let's say you're the academic who you may be tenured, you could be someone who has gotten all kinds of awards in his field, and if you come up, you stand before everybody, and you say the wrong thing, you're going to be excommunicated. And I mean, we're seeing this over and over again.
This is one of the reasons why I wanted to have this talk, because I see this happening. I've seen this happening in psychiatry for, well, at least 30 years.
It's across academia.
Well, it is. But it used to start in the social sciences. And in all fairness, the social sciences are mostly philosophies. They don't like it when you say that, but they are. Well, what we've also seen is that, for example, if we take the Stanford experiment, there were different ones. There was the blue-eyed, brown-eyed experiment as well. If we look at these experiments, the longer they run, the more extreme the behavior gets, because it becomes the new norm.
Well, sure. The problem, particularly with the Stanford experiment, was that the students were interviewed subsequently, and what they said was that they were faking it. They weren't actually in the level of distress that they were communicating to the doctors at the time. The reason that they were doing that was because they wanted them to open the door.
True, but these are the prisoners trying to get out.
Yeah, well, for sure. But the point is that isn't how it's
one sec. Yeah, I know, but I'm not looking at this from the prisoner side of point of view. Look at it from the guards' point of view. They went more extreme and extreme and extreme as well.
A lot of what they were said to have done came by the testimony of the prisoners, and the prisoners were. I mean, there was no physical evidence that the guards had actually done that.
That's
and
not
the
really
prisoners
true.
Are on record saying that they would have said anything to get out, because, and again, the issue was not that they found it distressing to be in the cage. Their issue was that they needed to take. Well, what they said, they were interviewed.
I know what they said, but I know this isn't true. And how do I know this? Years ago, I worked in prison. In the Netherlands. When a new prison is built, volunteers play inmates for a week.
Sure.
Everything they have to do is via the same schedule normal inmates would have acted, But these will only be here for a week. They know they're going to be there for a week in advance. They're not going to get out earlier, etc., etc., etc. What we are seeing is that within that week time, they will portray the very same behaviors as inmates do. Even though they know it's only for a week, yes, I'm not going to get out sooner. All I have to do is sit it out.
Well, I can't audit your example.
No, there isn't an example on this because it's based on the Stanford testing, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, the Stanford thing, as I pointed out, is flawed. So, but
it's a bit bullshit, but there is more to it that they are not saying. And this is the problem I'm having with most of the sociology researchers from the last 40 years. It's what they're not saying that is a real problem. Because if we look at the example I just gave, and I'm sorry I can't show you research on this because it hasn't been researched. Yeah. But I've actually experienced it.
Well, I appreciate.
I mean,
I appreciate that. With all respect, I won't. With all respect, I will not take it seriously, unless I can get something. Because my experience has been that there is a surface impression of these things, and then I dig into it, and it unravels. And if you give me something that I literally cannot examine, then I know. All respect, I simply won't take it seriously.
Well, that's your choice. I can't force you.
Yes.
What we do see is that certain behaviors, especially if it's for a longer period of time, become the new norm. Now, I'm not saying that they will become more aggressive, but both the inmates become not so much more aggressive, but easier in their morals, and the workers become easier in their morals too. Now, they don't get aggressive towards each other because the inmates know that they're not really inmates, and the prison guard workers know that they shouldn't be aggressive anyway. So these are things, this is society telling them what is and what isn't acceptable. But certain ways of interacting with each other does become more, how do you call that? Abrasive. I think abrasive is the best word. Okay, now I am going to be sorry, but I really do need a fast bio break. So I'll be right back.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry.
Well, there's no problem.
I hate this, but...
I should probably look at this thing.
Wait.
And there he is.
So I'm back. Sorry for that fast bio. Are you still there, mate?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Good. Yeah. But no, I was just wondering because I was AFK, so you could have been as well. Okay, to bring back to the point that I wanted to make. I can understand that you are like, okay, you don't have empirical evidence, so I don't have to take this serious. I understand that.
Yeah.
The problem that we see with sociological research, especially since the 70s, the 60s a little bit, but before that, it was actually good. You could disagree with it or you could agree with it, but you could understand where they were coming from. Since then, the value of sociological and psychological research has become, let's call it, tainted. And throughout the years, I've learned that the important thing when reading certain research is trying to realize and trying to see what isn't there.
Yeah.
The easiest way of giving an example is, for example, 60% of all domestic victims is female.
Well, I want to see it reproduced. That's one of the things I want to see. I want a neutral third party to reproduce it.
It has been reproduced many a time.
Well, so, it also has not been reproduced many times.
No. Well, you can. That's the problem with sociological research. You can make it say what the hell you want.
Well, that's an issue.
The 60% is relatively stable. I mean, sometimes it's 70%. It's never been below 55%. So that's relatively stable. But
no,
that means that 40% is male.
Oh, okay. You're talking about domestic abuse. I'm sorry. That's a
domestic violence. Domestic violence. This means 40% is male. At least, if we take 60 as female, that means 40% of the victims isn't. Well, female.
It also depends on how you define domestic abuse. I mean, it's such a nebulous concept in the first place. Because
okay,
well,
I disagree, but
well, okay. So like, somebody might get hit. Right. So let's say there's a man and a woman, and the woman slaps the man in the face,
which is abuse.
Right. But if you asked him if it were abuse, he might say no.
But that's a different story. I agree with you, and that's a different story.
And different cultures also might see that in different ways as well.
But then we come back to the cultural meanings. So this is what I said.
Right.
When we're talking about, for example, what is positive and negative behavior, if your society allows a certain form of negative behavior, then people will be far more likely to portray that negative behavior.
Well, right. But the thing is, okay, so particularly when you're dealing with international statistics, the way that what certain numbers mean in different countries are completely different. So, for example, infant mortality is a good one. The United States has a different definition of what a live birth is than other countries do. And that's not to say that the rest of the world has a uniform notion either. There's many countries have their own version of what that means. And so if you were to compile international statistics on infant mortality, the impression, if you didn't know any better, would be that they were all measuring it according to the same standard. But actually, they're not. It's like asking somebody what the temperature is from one country or another, and one answers in Fahrenheit, and the other answers in Celsius, and then there's no notation as to what happened there. And so one basically says, well, he says it's 50 degrees, and the other guy says it's 50 degrees, so it's the same temperature, right? Only one of them is Celsius and one of them is Fahrenheit, so they're completely different temperatures.
Yeah, but on average, if we look at the domestic violence thing. In the Western world, so America, Europe, Australia.
I don't know that. I'd have to study that.
Yeah, that's why I'm telling you. We use roughly the same things. But what we've seen in the last, let's say, 15 to 20 years, the research is being skewed. Well, this has always been the case, but it's being done more clearly, being skewed into recognizing women are the victim. Whereas, for as long as we can remember, it's not 50-50, but it's closer to 60-40 than to 70-30. So, and the worst part is domestic violence is more than just who hits who. There's way more to it. For example, most research in the Western world has also shown that women are far more likely to instigate domestic violence than men are. The difference is men hit harder, so men are more likely to finish domestic violence. The thing is, the deeper you look into it, the more you see.
Okay.
But very often, especially in the last 20 years, people are trying to get a fast score.
Okay. So I pulled up the U.S. definition. It is under the Violence Against Women Act of 1994, Section 3A. I mean, of course. I mean, look, I'm telling you, it's in there. And then it's also in the Violence Against Women and Department of Justice Reauthorization Act of 2005.
I know.
Man,
No, go on, go on.
there's no such law, I think, in Sweden. It doesn't say the Violence of Women Act and Department of Justice Reauthorization Act of 2005 in the Swedish Code of Law, right? So it will have different wording. So when someone tells me that it's the same thing in different countries,
Okay,
I question that because the legal.
Do you know what the Duluth model is?
The what? The Duluth model? I think.
Yes.
I think I've heard of it before.
Okay.
I off the top of my head, but I'm almost certain I've heard of it.
Okay. The Duluth model is a way for law enforcement to deal with domestic violence.
Okay.
Which basically boils down to that if domestic violence is reported, the police goes and assumes the man to be the perpetrator and takes him out of the situation.
Sure.
Even if the man called the police to protect himself.
Sure. Right. Okay. So very briefly.
One second. This is not something that is just happening in America.
Right.
The Duluth model is, unfortunately, the working model just about everywhere in the Western world.
Okay. Well, all right. It may well be, but okay. So it's defining it as a pattern of abuse behavior in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over another intimate partner. The definition adds that domestic violence can happen to anyone, regardless of race, age, sexual orientation, religion, or gender, and can take many forms, including physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional, economic, and psychological abuse. Now, is that similar to what, say, Italy defines domestic abuse to be, do you think?
I wouldn't know, but on average, yes.
Well, okay, well, let's pull up what that is. Look, I'm not saying this to be contentious. My interest is I'm a big fan of just looking. We have the internet at our fingertips here. It takes me seconds to look things up, so why not, right?
No, true that.
Carry on. We don't need to stop while I do this. I'll just do it.
But the thing is, we see that when people are looking at domestic violence, what a lot of people seem to forget is that it's, what's the English word for it? Reciprocity?
Yes, reciprocity.
Thank you. So if you have a domestic violence situation, then the victim isn't really a victim either.
Right.
It is very only a very few times from all the research that I've read are the victims actual 100% victim. I'm not saying it doesn't happen.
Sure.
But on average, both parties had a stake in the escalation of violence.
Sure.
So if we know this, then why the push for females as victim?
Oh, I mean, we obviously there are political axes to be ground on that, so I'm aware.
And this is the problem, and this is the problem we're seeing in sociology and philosophy. At the basis, political correctness stands on this. The people say, neo-Marxist, but unfortunately they're correct. Postmodernism, but unfortunately they are correct. These philosophies have a large influence in what's going on, and it is, in a way, destroying our society. This is, for example, why you have doctors subscribing medication, even though they bloody well know that they wouldn't give it to their own kids on the very same reason, but they do so because they feel forced to do so. This is why gender dysphoria can now be treated with hormones and reconstructive surgery, but body dysphoria like anorexia does not, because we recognize this is a mental illness. But we're not allowed to say that gender dysphoria is a mental illness. And I'm not bashing on people who suffer from that. Listen, if you're a transgender and you've really become a happy person whilst being someone else, hey, if it works, it works. Unfortunately, it's a group with a very high suicide rate or attempted suicide rate for a reason. These people aren't helped. And by going into their psychosis, we're only making it worse. And to come back to what you said in the last stream, well, but people can pretend to have certain afflictions.
Mm-hmm.
But you can always pretend, but the more you pretend, the more, once you get treatment and the person giving you treatment is actually doing his job, I'm not even saying good at his job, but just doing his job, they will recognize certain patterns repeating and certain patterns missing. So they will adjust their treatment to deal with your specific dysphoria, but they will also recognize that it is not what they thought it was.
I'm not sure if that's true, because drug-seeking behavior is very common amongst opiate addicts.
Oh yeah, definitely. Amongst all addicted people.
Right. And part of the reason that they do it is because it works. That is to say, there is a successful track record at getting doctors to prescribe them drugs that they do not need. Because they tell the doctor that they have certain symptoms, and the doctor prescribes them more opiates. And they do this for years.
I know.
Okay,
specifically when they go to different doctors from time to time.
Mm-hmm. Well, however they manipulate it, but the point is that they...
No. This is a very important point. This is a very important point. It really is. Okay. Because if I can manipulate one doctor, after a certain point of time, this doctor is going to say, wait a second, this is not true. This is not real. You're manipulating.
Well, yes and no. No, I understand what you're saying. A good doctor who cares, they will not be able to fool him forever. They may be able to fool him once or twice, but then what they'll do is they'll snap to the next doctor, and eventually they tend to find one that doesn't care or isn't paying attention. And also, certain doctors will get known within certain communities as being, that's the good doctor to go to. And so at a certain point, because the thing is, the addict cares more about finding the bunk doctor than, and this is the sad thing, the addicts care more about finding, wait a minute, let me finish here. The doctors, the addicts care more about finding the bad doctors than the medical institutions do. So the addicts are auditing the doctors because they want to find the bad doctor because they're their drug supply. They care more about finding that guy than does the medical board. Now if the medical board were worth anything, they would care at least as much, but they don't. I mean, objectively, they don't.
Mm-hmm.
So that casts a shadow on the integrity of that entire institution now, because you're demonstrating that opiate addicts care more about your lack of ethics than your board cares about the presence of those ethics.
Okay, I agree with you on all the things you said, but I find it strange that you do not recognize why this is. Because I completely agree with you, and I've said this at the very start, that there are physical doctors, PhDs, psychiatry, medical doctors at home, that are basically going through the motions to make their money, but they don't really care about
that's not what's in question here. It's that the institution itself, it's at a certain point is impugned by demonstrably caring less than the addicts do. And the reason is...
It's not just that the addicts do. It's worse than that. It's not that the addicts care more on where they can get their fix. It's that our society cares more on making sure that doctors don't care. It's not that we don't know which doctors don't care and therefore they're the bad ones. No. We've created a society where doctors aren't allowed to care anymore. That's the problem.
I don't know if that's necessarily true with opium pills.
What is body positivity?
Well, let's just concede body positivity and all that sort of jazz.
Okay. What is gender dysphoria?
Well, I was talking about opiate pills.
Yeah, I'll get there. Trust me.
Okay.
Well, then, gender dysphoria.
I'm not sure where you're going. What do you want me to say?
what is gender dysphoria? Just, it's a simple, direct question. I'll bring you to a point. Trust me. But
well, it's obvious. It's a psychological condition where
okay.
or a mental condition where you perceive something being wrong with your body,
Okay.
and are therefore feel uncomfortable until whatever it is addressed.
Okay. What is
that correct?
ADHD? Yeah, it is. It is. There are no wrong answers. Don't worry. What is ADHD?
Properly or improperly?
Both are good. Go on.
In my impression, it's generally a teacher that isn't very good at their job and has an enormous number of bored students. That's what I've noticed.
Okay. So these are your three answers.
I don't know if I gave three, but I'll just say sure.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I'm only going to address, well, I mean, with gender dysphoria, we already talked about, etc., etc. So ADHD is something relatively new. I'm going to go with ADHD.
Okay.
ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. We both know this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is this teachers not being able to entice their class? Well, this is the difficult part, because no, it is not. There are people who actually suffer from ADHD. And you can be the best teacher in the world, but a student suffering from ADHD, from real ADHD, will not be able to stay focused. They need either medication or therapy. They can have therapy without medication, to be honest. But you need to learn to deal with it.
Right.
But on average, at least 70% of all diagnoses of ADHD is a false diagnosis. This is not me saying this. This has been researched. I think even the World Health Organization recognized it at a certain point in time. So what is causing doctors to diagnose healthy kids with ADHD? Because there is a push from society.
I don't think it's society in general. I think it's literally the teacher.
No, it is society in general. It really is. You can even see from where. Sorry, needed to cough.
I mean, society is a collection of individuals, and in this case, it's the teacher making a complaint. The parents listening. It is.
No.
It's where it tends to start.
Let me tell you where it starts.
Well, I mean, I was there.
No, this is what happened to you. But
it was what happened to everybody in my classroom, buddy.
But that's not where it started.
Okay.
It started even before we were born.
All right.
It started just before the Second World War, when there were philosophers talking about the designability of a society.
Oh, okay. You're talking about utilitarianism.
It is a form of totalitarianism.
No, I said, yeah, utilitarianism.
I know, but it still is a form of totalitarianism.
Okay.
Because you're trying to change what is into what you need it to be.
Right.
So boys aren't allowed to be bolsterers anymore. Boys being bolsterers is a problem. Why? Because you can't control them as easily.
Well,
by giving you certain medication, you become docile.
Yeah. No, I there's full agreement on the docility thing.
And that's where it started. Now, what caused our medical doctors to fall into this trap? Because no one thinks this is a good idea. When you talk about medical doctors, when they're honest, they will tell you, no, we wish we could do something better than this.
Yeah.
The worst part is we can. But when both parents are working and both parents come home, the parents are both tired as well. Now, the kids, especially boys, when they come home from school, they have a lot of pent-up energy because they're not that good at sitting still for such a long time. So they want to spend that energy with their parents. Their parents are tired. So this is a clash in our society.
Sure.
And to diminish that clash, they drug our children.
Well,
They're not
predominantly, I think it's for this, it's for the classroom and not for when they get home. But
Yeah,
I mean,
it's also for when they get home. That's where it started, and the
Mm.
classroom too. I mean, when I was younger in the Netherlands, we had every day we would go out and run a bit and play around and whatnot, which would
Sure.
expend our physical energy. For a long time, in the Netherlands, they're now turning it back, but for a long time, kids weren't allowed to do that.
Mm.
Now there are lots of kids' schools that start with half an hour of running before they start their lessons.
Well, we had recess and everything.
Yeah, but recess isn't enough because you only have like 15 minutes recess.
No, it was like an hour. We had a long time. We did.
Well, that's slightly better.
I mean, how many hours do I need, man? An hour is pretty good.
Depends on what you do in that hour.
I guess we were running around. We were playing sports.
Well, that is good. That is good.
Yeah, we did running. We did touch football was something we did. So it's instead of tackle football, you do touch.
Yeah, I know.
Which is good for little kids. But
it's a good way to expend your energy.
Yeah, we did basketball, we did dodgeball, we did all kinds of stuff. It was great.
Yeah.
The issue was true. I believe truly that a good number of teachers are legitimately bad at their jobs.
Oh, I definitely believe that in America.
And I think historically, when a teacher was that bad, they would wash out of the profession at a certain point because they weren't able to control the students. And so I think what's occurred, at least this is part of the puzzle. I'm not saying this is the entirety of the puzzle, but I think part of the puzzle is that there's been a shifting of blame from the teachers to the students, and they ignore that the entire fucking class in sometimes is not able to pay attention to this person.
Well, it's even worse.
And that ignores that there are other teachers teaching the exact same subject that don't have this problem.
True that. Yeah. Okay, so now look at those teachers.
Yeah.
When you were a kid, how many of your teachers were male and how many of your teachers were female?
Oh, I want to say probably 80%, maybe 90% were female, something like that. There's an occasional dude, but it was mostly not.
So you had a male teacher. And
somewhere in there.
I'm not going to say all males are good and all females are bad. So I'm not going to say all males are good and all females are bad.
No.
But I'm 100% sure that you responded slightly different with that male teacher than with the average female teacher.
Well, okay, so here's something that everybody knows about men and women. This is something that isn't politically correct, but men and women carry themselves differently, and they interact with groups in a different way.
And there you have the basis of the problem.
Well, sure. And so I had a sociology teacher, and he was actually somewhat aggressive with the students. He demanded you pay attention to him, and if you did not, he would do something to make you regret it real fast. And he put up with no shit from anybody. And if you wanted to get in a shouting match with him, he would make some kid piss himself, and he would then laugh as you went to the nurse. He did not care. He was amazing. But
I'm pretty sure that most students in the class, especially the boys, appreciated the guy.
Generally, yeah, he really knew what he was talking about, and he didn't do it indiscriminately. It was not something that he meted out to a child that was not asking for it. No. So there were certain kids that were problem kids, and they would challenge him, and they'd be disruptive and whatever. And he would say, "Oh, you are challenging me? You are a child. I will destroy you." And he did. Yeah. He didn't hit anybody.
Listen, I 100% understand what you're talking about. I know people like that, and there are people out there who say I'm like that. And you know what? That's a badge of honor.
Yeah, no, I agree. No, it's asserting dominance. And for little boys, I think it's important for teachers to be able to maintain dominance.
It's more than asserting dominance. It's way more than asserting dominance. You know what it is? It's teaching what is and is not acceptable.
Sure. Well, it's maintaining respect. That's another thing. You know.
And the funny thing is, I'm not sure because I wasn't there, but I can easily see that a kid that's being berated today and get his ass chewed out, but comes back the next day, is behaving well and is therefore rewarded for behaving well, will have more respect for this teacher than the teachers that wouldn't let him get away with his negative behavior.
I'll give you a brief anecdote of something that he did once. So there was a kid, I remember to this day, a kid had fallen asleep in his class, or at least had put his head down on his desk. And so the teacher continues his lecture. He's still making eye contact. He's in no way signaling to the classroom that he has even noticed that this child is doing this. And he nonchalantly goes over and he picks up a textbook, and he puts that textbook on top of another textbook. And then he takes another textbook and he puts it on top of those two textbooks. Then he picks up all three textbooks and he continues his lecture. He's not stopping. He walks over, very casually to the desk immediately next to the kid that's sleeping. Gestures, briefly for the other child to move his stuff off of his own desk. And then the teacher slammed all three textbooks down on the desk, right next to the other kid's head. Now, again, it's on a desk next to his, so there's no danger of hurting the other kid. It just made a loud noise. I understand. And he at no point stopped his lecture, and then the other kid was startled and looked up like, "Wah!" and the teacher didn't even look at him, picked up the three textbooks after he'd slammed them down, and he casually walked back over to his desk and continued his lecture. That's the sort of thing he would do. And it was really good for just little things like that. It would keep everybody paying attention, and if you messed with him, he would do something that would make you regret it, but he wouldn't hurt anybody. He would just make you stop. So
children in this case, learn how to behave, what behavior is acceptable, what behavior is not. Now imagine that you have teachers that fear to do that. Not even fail to do that, but actually fear to do that.
Sure. No, I'm aware.
So then you want to have docile children.
Absolutely.
And this is political correctness. This is something that's been starting since the 60s, I'm going to say. A lot of our problems started around that time. Hiccups, sorry. And this is why I have such a problem with what is and isn't acceptable within psychiatry, sociology, because a lot of this is, we're talking about, you put a house on fire and you're complaining that it's warm. The house being on fire seems to me like a bigger problem.
I agree.
And this is why this is why I love to do this talk, and we're going slightly different than I had anticipated. I won't lie.
I apologize. I'm trying to respond with integrity and honesty.
No, definitely. This is not a complaint, my friend. It really isn't. It's just that, considering the talks we had last time, I thought we would go into that direction. This conversation went in a completely different direction. It's not any less important. So this is not you having to apologize. This is me recognizing that I anticipated something else and find myself where I am now. This is not a positive or negative thing. Listen, if I'm going to have a conversation with you and I'm already knowing what we're going to talk about, then I'm not having a conversation with you. So in no means does this mean I disagree with you. Or that this is your fault. Actually, I like this. But our societies have been harmed by certain ideologies. And the political correctness is one of the main things that came out of it. And as you said yourself, it permeates everything. It permeates schools, psychology, psychiatry, most of the non-hard sciences. It's trying to wriggle its way into hard sciences. Hence the Common Core debacle.
Well, also the physicists have started to get nannied for having too many male physicists. So they're 80%
of the school teachers is female, and somehow the ones doing all the really hard educational progress, like going to university and learn math in a high level, most of them are male. Now, this is weird considering that 80% of the teachers are female. You would have thought that this would give women a push, but no, it doesn't.
Well, so it's getting into all those fields. As I pointed out, it's also getting into the open source community. What I perceive being something that seems to be a consistent element is it always seems to come in through an institution that applies a kind of oppression on the existing group of people, where they start applying some rules, and it isn't necessarily that the people inside of the box agree, it's that they are compelled. And so I don't necessarily see it as everyone kind of clapping along and saying, isn't this fantastic? It's sort of like what happened in Soviet Russia, where all the people that disagreed with the Communist Party found themselves in a gulag.
Oh, well, some of the people who agreed but didn't agree on the right reason found themselves in the gulag as well. But
exactly.
This is coming back to the Stanford experiment of yours. When you said, well, this is what they did. And I told you, now imagine a society where this behavior is acceptable. Then those numbers would have been far worse. And we know this.
Well,
and in all fairness, even though there are no hard research on this, because they're not allowed to happen. You yourself just now admitted that this was the case.
Well, sure. No, but I didn't admit that the dichotomy that exists within the Stanford prison experiment is a legitimate conclusion. What I admitted was that political correctness occurs because everyone who does not conform with it is silenced.
Which is
that's a different thing.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is.
No.
Okay, well, so the people in the prison have the freedom to say that they are happy or unhappy in the prison. They are not free to leave the cell, but they are free to express whatever opinion they like within the cell.
No, they're not.
Yes, they are.
Well, officially they are, but then self-censorship comes in.
Well, okay, so what would be the self-censorship in the context of the Stanford prison experiment?
This is not just the prisoners that were being censored, by the way.
Okay, fine. How were the guards being censored?
Well, because certain behaviors are expected. And if you did not comply, and this is true for the guards just as much as it was for the prisoners. Now, we only look at the prisoners, obviously, but this is true for the guards as well. If you did not comply, you were wrong. And being wrong in itself isn't that hard, but humans are herd animals, and being wrong is a form of ostracization. I'm sorry, but I butchered that.
No, that's acceptable. The English language, as you're well aware, is kind of a plastic creature.
Yeah, well, it's not my first language either.
No, so I appreciate that, but you can. We are obliged as speakers of it to not take its rules especially seriously, because they're merely guidelines. Anyone who doesn't think that doesn't understand the language.
No, and any live language needs to be able to change. But going back to the point, once you get ostracized by your peers, this is by far one of the worst things that can happen to you.
Yeah. So
you start self-censoring. You start behaving in a pattern that you expect is expected of you.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you to a certain extent. I would just point out that a lot of this is coming down as an institutional edict. So, for example, if I'm on Twitter and I say something that is the wrong thing, I can get my account suspended.
True.
Now, that isn't my peers ostracizing me. That is an institution coming down and silencing me.
True.
So, likewise, if I'm going
to interrupt you there because you are overstepping something. Because yes, it's an institution stopping you, but that institution feels it has the power to do so.
Sure.
Because it has the support of so many people.
Well, not even necessarily. A lot of times, the population that feels it has that support is highly localized and is estranged from the majority of the population. So, for example, when Mark Zuckerberg or when Facebook, for example, deletes or suspends a Facebook account, they didn't take a poll of all the Facebook accounts. There's no vote, and it could well be that should you take such a poll, that they would disagree with the official opinion of Facebook. In fact, in quite a few cases, it's highly likely. So that's not your peers. Not even if we were to assume that all of the other people on Facebook are your peers, and that's ridiculous because they're obviously not. You don't even know these people, right? But even if you were to do that, and certainly your own friends, your actual peers are very unlikely to say, oh yeah, screw Dave, we should delete his account. They'd be like, no, Dave just does that. He gets drunk and he starts talking about something, and because everybody knows to leave the guy alone. And the people who have a more public account, so like let's say you've got one of the politically contentious Facebook pages or Twitter feeds or whatever you want to go with. The people who are the target audience of those feeds, generally speaking, are not only not offended by whatever the guy said, but they self-select that content because they wish to see it, even if many other people might be offended by it. That's what they want to see. So you see the same thing in Reddit. There was a somewhat popular board that was making fun of fat people on Reddit. The people that were going to that board to make fun of fat people were not offended that there was a board that made fun of fat people. And if you were to poll all the different boards or all the people on all the boards on Reddit, it's very likely that they would have said, well, that's kind of a shitty thing to do, but I'm not going to say that they don't have the right to do it. I mean, I'm not going to go there, right? So it's one of those things where a lot of people would say, I have the right to not go to that board, and therefore I don't see it, and that's enough for me. But then there are other people who are annoyed that it exists anywhere, and they want to purge it there. Now, I'm not saying any of this as support of the fat-shaming Reddit channel or what have you. It's that this censorship, almost without exception, comes down institutionally rather than through some sort of peer democratic process, which would more authentically represent peer pressure. This is coming down instead, almost like the way that a law does in a tyranny. If Saddam Hussein says that I'm not allowed to eat sandwiches on Tuesday, that's not because my peers don't like it. It's because Saddam Hussein doesn't like it.
Yeah, but now you're making a small misunderstanding of reality. Because Mark Zuckerberg is doing what he's doing, and Jack Dorsey is doing what he's doing because he feels he has... how can I best describe this? He has the Bolshevik behind him. I'm using the word Bolshevik for a moment.
I understand.
Because Bolshevik means the majority.
It's a majority maybe in San Jose, California.
No. Wait. The Bolshevik never were the majority.
Right.
But they call themselves the majority.
Sure.
And they do so because people on average will side with whom they think is the majority.
No one thinks San Jose, California is the majority.
No one does.
No. So then why? They're the Bolshevik in this case. They're not the majority though. No one thinks they are.
No one outside of the bubble thinks they are.
Yes, exactly. The bubble is the point though.
Right.
But
that bubble is forcing control, and that bubble is, destroying our society.
Well, there was a journalist who famously said, I don't know anyone who voted for Richard Nixon. I believe it was Nixon that she said that. And, she was a someone who came out of New York, and it was just her social circle didn't know anybody that voted for him. Yeah, now, the guy won a presidential election, so clearly there were a lot of people who did vote for him. But inside of her bubble, I'm going to take her at her word, there was nobody that did.
Well, I'm going to take her word with a grain of salt, and this is the grain of salt. Would it at all be possible that people weren't comfortable to tell her
Sure,
they
of
voted
course.
for Nixon? And
Yeah,
there you
of
have
course.
it.
No, I mean,
so,
like,
so we're talking about a form of self-censorship again.
well, absolutely. No, I mean, I mean, I'm not discounting entirely this the concept of peer pressure. That would be absurd. Obviously, peer pressure and social pressure is a very powerful force. Everyone wants to feel like they fit in. But I think a lot of times there is an attempt to control the impression of it through institutional influence, wherein someone shapes the community by using the institution to impose itself and masquerade as a peer opinion when it is not authentically a peer opinion. It is in fact an institutional edict that is creating an imperative that everybody follows certain rules.
Yeah, and this is the problem with political correctness, because political correctness isn't the majority, but people believe it is the majority, and because of that, the Southern Poverty Law Center can push out certain edicts saying that Alex Jones is terrible, whilst at the same time defending Antifa, who is destroying your inner cities. Not your inner city, because this is happening in Europe too. And now people like Sargon get deplatformed from Patreon because Patreon feels, according to what people say, that he's the bad guy. But they have no problem supporting people who push the destruction of the Western society.
Sure.
So we're talking about the Bolsheviks, the ones that claim to be the majority.
Yep. No, I'm fully on board with you on that.
People like what's that CEO from Apple that felt
Tim
that
Cook.
he had the right to say, okay, we're not going to platform this because we disagree with it. And people might say, yeah, it's a private company, he does have that right. Yeah, but no. And why do I say but no? Because they're not a publisher. If they were a publisher, I would say you're 100% correct, because then they would also be financially responsible for what they published. But they're not a publisher, so they don't carry that responsibility.
Well, the lack of integrity is more obvious than that, in that if you put the shoe on the other foot and you deplatformed the people that they liked, they would go directly to the Supreme Court. So a good example would be Donald Trump's Twitter feed.
Yes.
So Donald Trump was blocking Twitter trolls on his feed. I mean, obviously he wasn't, but whoever's managing that thing. And it's not like anybody honestly cares. It's like 99% of what anybody says on Twitter is bullshit. And that includes most of what Donald Trump probably says, because he gets on there to tease people. That's sort of what he does with it.
Yeah, trolling.
It's like whatever. And so he's getting on there. He's doing that. People go on there, and they mostly are making snarky comments against his account. And so what he wants to do is block them so that they can't do that, which is what everybody else does on Twitter when some snarky person starts responding on their feed. And then some clown goes to the Supreme Court, or I don't know if it was even the Supreme Court. It's probably one of the appellate courts or whatever. They went to a federal judge, and the federal judge beclowned himself by saying that, well, because it's such a prominent account of national import, you blocking someone on Twitter is a violation of the First Amendment rights. Which is ridiculous, because if I were a president and I wrote an op-ed to the New York Times, which presidents do sometimes, many politicians will make opinion pieces. They'll submit editorials to prominent national newspapers, and those national newspapers will publish them in their paper. And generally speaking, the comments on editorials are blocked. Sometimes they do display, but when they do display, sometimes someone will say something that some editor at the paper or whoever is moderating website will feel is inappropriate for the paper for whatever reason, and they will delete that comment.
Censorship.
Now, so of course, and they do so pervasively and without any oversight or suggestion that oversight would even be appropriate. So had Donald Trump, for example, submitted an editorial to one of the major newspapers, and then one of those newspapers had deleted or moderated the comment section on the editorial, no one would have gone to the Supreme Court or one of the appellate courts. So the point is there's no authentic principle that underlies the ruling, and it's on both sides of their position. So they say it's okay because it's a corporation, and then they say it's not okay because it's the president. The thing is that you can find exceptions that exist on both ends of that rule that basically conform to whatever is convenient to them from one moment to the next. They will not sacrifice and absorb something they dislike on the basis that there is a principle they're trying to uphold. They will only push it when it benefits them, and then flip around and betray it the instant it doesn't. And so there's no integrity.
That's the thing when we talk about, for example, free speech. Free speech is only free speech if it allows things that I disagree with.
Yes, precisely.
Because if it only is what I allow, then yeah, I'm sorry, it's not free speech. It's basically speech. Now, for example, I've never been a fan of Alex Jones, but the dude should have a right to peddle his nonsense.
I grew up listening to a guy that would only show up on AM radio at about midnight. There's this crazy guy by the name of Art Bell. Have you ever heard of Art Bell?
No.
Art Bell, he did this program called Coast to Coast AM, and he did it out of the desert. He's some madman out in the middle of the desert with a radio antenna. And what he would talk about was aliens, ghosts, conspiracy theories, secret societies. That was basically stuff like that. And the show would run pretty much, I think, from midnight to 4 a.m. was his time slot, and it was on the least desirable spectrum of our communications network, and it was on the least desirable portion of time that anyone wanted to say anything because everyone's asleep. And that's when he would run his show, and he was a legend. Everybody out here knows who Art Bell is because and he was going for years. They got a new guy who's kind of kept the torch burning, but the guy was just kind of a thing. And if you tuned your radio to just this certain spectrum late at night, you would get this guy talking about ghosts and goblins, and he was totally goddamn serious every single time. Vampires are real. Aliens are real. It was the whole thing. And I appreciated his existence. Not because I think vampires and aliens are real, but because why shouldn't some guy be able to go out there and badger to the spoon? Just go completely.
That's the thing.
Some guy wants to get on a soapbox and talk about the vampires. Go for it, buddy.
Yeah, no, that's the same thing I have with any religion. I don't care what people believe in. They have the right to believe anything they want. It becomes a problem when they want me to believe it. And it's even worse, they don't want me to believe it, but I have to act according to it. No, I'm sorry.
Well, it's the coercion in particular that's the issue, I think, and that's where the institution comes in play, because there are an enormous number of people in my society that would be very happy to stand up to political correctness and tell it to go fuck itself, and they would withstand the slings and arrows of their peers' approval or disapproval. They wouldn't care. What becomes the real silencing point is that then the institution silences them. And that's really the issue. And that's the real oppression. It's that the government comes in and says who's allowed to speak and who's not allowed to speak.
Well, I would go one further, because it's not just the government that is the problem. If we look at monopolies in the tech industry, for example, there's something sincerely wrong when Twitter can decide who is and is not allowed to be on their platform. When YouTube can decide who is or who or isn't allowed to be on their platform. Actually, by doing so, they make themselves responsible for everything on their platform. Twitter and YouTube both were started as open forums, which meant that whatever you posted is on you. You're the one responsible.
Yeah.
But by taking responsibility of who is and isn't allowed to post, in all fairness, everything negative posted on Twitter at this point in time implicates Twitter. They are now responsible. So, for example, if someone tweets "kill all whites" or whatever, then by law we are able to basically charge Twitter.
Well, no, because they've gotten into the Justice Department as well. They've gotten into the court system. So, and that's where.
But at the
but see, that's where it becomes a governmental matter. So you look at, say, Twitter may have the right to do one thing or not have a right to do something, but then there's no consistency, and I think that's a lot of what you're talking about. Is that you're okay with it? Well, they're not going to give you consistency, and the reason that they not only will they not, but they don't have to, because they've gotten into the judges to this point. So if you go before the judge, he will give you a ruling that goes along with the politically correct answer now, even if the law says nothing about that, because there's enough wiggle room in the way that everything works. And I'm not suggesting there not be that wiggle room, because you can't have a robot effectively do a judicial hearing. Everything is going to come down to some level of human discretion or judgment. The problem is that there are a lot of unethical judges that are interested in promoting a lot of positions that are not in the law. It's not the letter of the law. It's not the spirit of the law. So what are you going to do? But
therein lies the problem, and
that's the institution.
Why? Yeah, but this is why, and this is not only true for America. This is also true for Europe. This is why I'm afraid that a revolution is imminent. And in America, the fact that Donald Trump came to power might be hope, might be the turning to.
It's unlikely. You have to remember that for every person that voted for him, there's somebody who didn't.
But it's not just the people that voted for him; it's the ones that are in power. So I hope that the American politicians will return to the rule of law, because I fear that the alternative may be a lot bleaker.
Yeah. Maybe.
And this is not something I'm looking forward to. Don't get me wrong.
No, I know.
But if we look at what happened in the First World War and Second World War, I'm sorry, but the stage is set again.
Well,
you'd think people would learn.
Let me posit an alternative scenario, because this is what I see. I see a lot of these institutions, which, keep in mind, the thesis of my position is that it's the institutions that really have been pushing this stuff along. That a lot of these institutions are getting bypassed. So we see alternative media increasingly as a thing, despite the fact that Google and Twitter and all kinds of other big tech companies are censoring people. The nature of the technology is it makes censorship at a systemic level almost impossible. The technology, even in China, where they have enormous censorship and no pesky First Amendment to deal with, they have a difficulty controlling dissident opinion. And if they've got a hard time doing it in China, they're going to have a harder time doing it in the United States. We're also seeing, when you talk about education institutions, we're seeing a rise of alternative education, which if you consider that the point of getting the degree or what have you is getting the job that allows you to have the standard of living that you desire, a lot of people are able to obtain that without going through a traditional university. So I could go through, a continuing series of institutions where there's something that's coming up that undermines its monopoly on and a gatekeeper on certain things in society. as their corruption and their inflexibility increases, it increases the incentive to bypass them, and the technology is providing a means to do so. And so it encourages people to do that. So I think that's the direction. I don't think we're going for a revolution necessarily. Not an armed, violent uprising. I think that there is going to be an increasing turning of backs on certain institutions that perceive themselves to be eternal and indispensable. And should this occur, what will happen is suddenly no one will show up one day and no one will care.
Yeah, and the worst thing that you can have in a society is people not caring.
Well, but it won't matter if whatever the institution was supposed to do is still getting done. I mean, let's say nobody buys the newspaper one day, but everybody is just as informed.
Yeah, that's the question, though.
Yeah.
Because there are more people being informed by social media than by the normal media. Mm-hmm. But social media is also the place where most of the silencing is being done. Mm-hmm. So that this is scary, but we've gone totally off of topic, by the way. But
it's what I do. I do not do it intentionally, sir. But it is. It's because I see them as all a holistic concept, and so I don't see it as off topic.
In that, I totally agree, and this is why we started with psychiatry and sociology and psychology and philosophy.
Well, I think because the wider issue is corruption, isn't it?
The wider issue is corruption.
Yeah.
Having said all that, though, we've been talking for 1.5 hours, and I really enjoyed our talk.
Okay.
But I don't think a lot of people will see this, which is a shame, really, because I really think we said a lot of important things, both you and me, even though we didn't always agree eye to eye. But as usual,
how boring would it be if we had?
Oh, true that.
You know, you might as well get rid of one of us and just have the other guy say what the other guy would say.
Well, in that case, I'll just kick you then.
Yeah, boom. Absolutely. You might as well if we're just going to agree, right?
No, that's true. And but I think we can both agree that the problem is that there are nuances at play, and we are being led astray. Let's say it simple.
Sure. Absolutely.
But I don't want to restart the whole thing again. I did enjoy our talk, and I really like to thank you for it. It was a really good talk.
It was my pleasure, Modwain. Anytime.
Yeah, considering that we've been busy for 1.5 hours, and this was supposed to be a little bit faster than a normal. I mean, normal House of Fun is usually 2 hours. This was supposed to be half of that.
Yeah.
Well, not yours. It wasn't supposed to be by you. This is what I had in my mind.
Right. No, I can bullshit for days, buddy.
Yeah, me too. But as I said earlier, this talk went slightly different than I had anticipated, and I really enjoyed it. So that's.
Oh, me too. Well, thank you for having me on.
You're more than welcome, and you're welcome to return anytime. But this is where we're going to say good night. Do you want to finish up with anything?
No. I think it's been comprehensive. Thank you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed our talk, even though it went all over the place, but that is normal for me. Then, for those few people that did look in and listen, then thank you very much. Your criticism, as always, is more than welcome. I look forward to what you have to say.
I will accept nothing but glowing adoration. Worship at my feet.
Glowing adoration, as in nuclear adoration?
I mean, that's what will happen if you don't worship me.
Ah, all right. Because the sun is glowing, but I don't want it too close to me anyway.
I mean, it's going to come.
See, it's all about nuance. Anyway, before we get started all over again, thank you very much for coming, people, and see you all next time.